Why, hello there, old sports. Now, just like the last video, this video is not exactly the video I was planning on making in this order, but this is the beginning of the video, so I have to hook people before they leave. So, Dark World Necromancy. Yep, that's what we're talking about today. I'd like to start out this video by mentioning that even if Oberon Smog as a theory was dead, the fact that the reasoning behind it was mostly sound is absolutely hilarious to me. Because before Chapter 4, when the concept was blatantly introduced, there were a few theories prior to Chapters 3 and 4 about if dark fountains could bring things back to life. The most prominent of these theories mostly surrounded if Noelle would try to revive her father through some dark fountain magic. But regardless of any theories we may have crafted, actually seeing Gerson come back and then finding his body, I guess, later, I hesitate to use the term body considering it's mostly a pile of dust. But it was quite a surprise, but a welcome one to be sure. Now this does make sense, you just kind of have to end up acknowledging the uncomfortable fact that when something sentient dies, it goes from being alive to just being an object. And that's what darkeners are, just reanimated objects, so it does make sense that literally just taking a corpse and doing dark magic to it would reanimate it. However, thankfully there is a degree of separation considering the fact that monsters turn to dust when they die, so it's not like we just opened Alvin's shelf and found Gerson's corpse clumsily stuffed in there. That would probably be even more awkward. Now obviously, I'm not going to try to convince you if necromancy is real or not in Deltarune, because in a way it is, but I would rather just talk about the mechanics behind it and how it works, if it does work at all. Now the first point of discussion I'd like to bring up is that I think it'd be more accurate to call what dark fountains do to deceased lighteners more of a reincarnation or a reimagining than revival. The dark worlds created by the fountains and the darkeners within have been stated to be shaped by the fountain creator's will and desires. The best and most obvious example of this is how Gerson is portrayed in each sanctuary. Assuming for the moment that the knight is Des had Gerson as a teacher, and thus there's a better chance she knew him, so since the knight is the one who created the first and third sanctuaries, he is represented most of the time as the old professor. In the second sanctuary, however, since it was made by Susie, and she didn't really get to know Gerson, all that is made from his remains are basically just a hollow statue. It laughs with his voice, it kind of sounds like him in some aspect, it kind of looks like him in some aspect, but it's a completely hollow interpretation of who he was. I'd also like to bring up that the only times we get to see Gerson in his Hammer of Justice form are during the fight with the Titan and the fight with Susie, and in those very specific circumstances, he acts as more of a symbol than anything. My interpretation of this is that, since we're only seeing him through Susie and Chris and Ralsei's eyes, it's easier to kind of mix between the two, that being the warrior and the man. And the reason this is possible is because Gerson as the Hammer of Justice is kind of representing the protagonist of Gerson's novels, and since he kind of wrote himself, or aspects of himself, into the protagonist of that series, it makes sense that the two are easier to blend together. As Ralsei says, darkeners parted after the memories of a loved one tend to only appear in very specific darkness. So I feel pretty confident in saying that it's hard to say this is a pure revival of the person because it's so dependent on who is the revivee, if that makes any sense. The less you know the person who's being remade, the less like them they'll really be. However, I would also like to bring up that even these more accurate depictions of the characters after they're revived are probably still a good ways off from who that person was in real life. And by real life, I mean like in real life, in the universe. Jumping over to Undertale for a moment, we get to talk to Gerson while he's alive, and it makes sense because everyone in Deltarune is a little bit older than they were in Undertale, so it makes sense that Gerson's age caught up to him. But Gerson is different in a few ways than his counterpart that we get to see in Deltarune. Now, obviously, this partially does come down to the two different worlds these characters are in, because on one hand, we have Gerson in Deltarune, who's a writer. He makes fiction for a living, or he writes fiction, while in Undertale, Gerson writes history. He's a historian, he keeps track of history, because he's in a different world scenario, and he's had different life experiences. Looking over Gerson's dialogue in Undertale, he seems a teensy bit more pessimistic than he was in Deltarune, and again, part of that is being hopelessly stuck underground for most of your life. That would probably do it to you. But again, it is a difference. But something I feel like I want to dwell on and bring up is that the version of Gerson we get to see in Deltarune, or at least in the Dark Fountains, he seems to be a bit more idealized. He's not as well-rounded of a character as someone like Susie or Ralse is. And now I'm not saying Gerson isn't well written, because he is, and he's probably the highlight of the chapter for me. But it's hard to call him a fully fledged out character, because there's not really many character flaws that we can see in him. And I think this was very intentional, because as I just said earlier, the way the person is portrayed in the Dark World comes down to whoever made the fountain and their memory of them. And of course, if whoever made those fountains knew Gerson when he was alive, they probably have mostly good memories of him. Now, to talk philosophy for a teensy bit, I do think it's interesting how, in real life, when someone is considered a good person, it's easier to wipe away any bad they've done, or it's easier to forgive those things. While when someone is considered a bad person, it's easier to write off any good they've done. It kind of just comes down to outliers. It's not things that are them. That person wasn't like that, so these actions that they did in one way or the other, that wasn't the real them, or that was just a mistake, or that wasn't intentional, or even a broken clock is right twice a day sort of scenario. So even if the knight isn't Death's, keeping in mind that most people in the town seem to like Gerson, or have fond memories of him, it makes sense that the version of him that would appear in the knight's dark world would be this more idealized version of him. Because the old man that we see in Deltarune Chapter 4, he fits pretty well with how Alvin describes him, or how the Tombstone describe him, because those people saw him in a very certain way. They have mostly positive impressions of him. They saw him as the teacher, and the mentor, and the person who was there to lighten up their day. And I think that's why Gerson in the Dark World can't really do much wrong, because that's not who he was made to be as a Darkener. He was a wise old man who cared about those around him, and he was a symbol for everyone else. I'd even argue that some of his more negative-leaning quirks still kind of fit under this explanation, because lots of that stuff, people will look back on people's flaws and be like, oh, that was just them, that was funny looking back on it, even if it annoyed me in the moment, or that was him, that was like, because it is them, you kind of associate some of that stuff with positive memories, even if the action itself was more neutral, if that makes sense. I wouldn't be surprised if we see a Darkener version of another character who passed away, and they're depicted a lot more negatively, because of the opposite reasons. If they were seen as mostly a negative person around the town, and then they were reincarnated in a dark world, it would make sense that, since everyone just saw them as a bad person, they end up becoming more of a villain in the dark world. But I'm just writing fanfiction at this point. Another thing I'd like to notice is that I see a lot of people bringing up, oh wow, Gerson is so strong, I wonder how all this stuff happened in Undertale, or I wonder how this would have happened here, here, and here. But I think people are overlooking the fact that the Hammer of Justice we see in Deltarune Chapter 4 in that boss fight is, again, more of an idealized version of him, melded with the character from the book he wrote. In the waterfall area of Undertale, there are multiple murals describing how the war between humans and monsters went, and they go out of their way to point out that it was more of a massacre than a war. No humans died, but plenty of monsters did. This kind of comes down to how much more powerful humans just are inherently in this universe than monsters. So when I see people talk about how, oh, Gerson must have been a monster on the battlefield, wiping out humans left and right, in Undertale as the Hammer of Justice, I kind of feel like some people are missing the point. If a level 1 Frisk is able to bring down Undyne, who trained with Asgore and Gerson, and at that point in the timeline is fully out to kill Frisk, then I highly doubt Gerson could have killed many trained human soldiers. Because when it comes down to it, I think that's part of the reason why it was such a one-sided stomp for the humans, because assuming that all of the people fighting in the war were adults, it would make sense that human soldiers would be much more of a threat than Frisk is, considering Frisk is like 11 in Undertale, and using a stick as a weapon. So if you had fully grown adult humans who were trained and were using actual weapons, yeah, it would make sense that it was not much of a fight. So all that rambling aside, my point I'm trying to establish is that, yeah, it makes sense that Gerson would be more of a threat in the Dark World because we're taking on an idealized version of him who's being powered up by the darkness. Because Chris can go from being level 1 and having 20 health to being level 1 and having 90 health in the Dark World. So, my ultimate point here with all this is that it's kind of hard to call what the Dark Worlds are doing bringing someone back to life. While yes, someone who is close to the figure may be able to recreate them in a mostly accurate manner, it is very easy for that version of the person to be a little more two-dimensional. And if you didn't know that person well, as we saw with Susie, that can end up being very dangerous. Obviously, one of the major themes of Deltarune seems to be escapism, and I don't think the game is going to go in a escapism bad direction. I think it will probably go in a escapism is good, in moderation direction. So, using the theme of escapism, that being the dark fountains, to bring someone back to life is a very interesting idea to me, at least on a thematic level. But I think Susie's experience with Gerson is ultimately the best possible outcome of this sort of thing happening. He taught her some valuable lessons, and he showed her how to do things that she thought she couldn't do when she could have done them all along. So yes, while the old man did help the Fun Gang defeat the Titan, I don't think his sole purpose there was to help them. I think it was, or help them physically, I mean. I think his purpose there was to give them enough time to figure out how to do it on their own, be the helping hand to pick them back up so they could finish the job. Because if you think about it, Chris and Susie probably could have defeated the Titan on the first turn its shield was down, but Gerson was kind of there to help them. He didn't do it for them, he just showed them the way. And as I said, ultimately, I think that's the best possible outcome from someone being brought back by the Dark Fountain. Now, if I can wildly speculate for a moment, we know that Rudy's illness will end up taking his life, because if they couldn't save him in Undertale, I highly doubt they can do it in Deltarune. So, what I think is going to happen is that Noelle is going to try to bring her father back through the power of a dark fountain once she learns they're real, because I'm assuming she's going to figure that out at some point. Regardless, I think there's the possibility she might try to bring her father back through a dark fountain. So, I could totally see the positive way to resolve that situation being that we make her realize that the version of Rudy in the Dark World isn't the same as in the Light World. He isn't the same person, he's just an idealized memory. But again, that has no basis in reality currently. I am just wildly making stuff up at this rate. I'd also like to bring up the idea that the Knight is like a zombified, reanimated thing from the Dark World. My personal theory is that the Knight is like something in between a Lightener and a Darkener, but again, I don't really have much evidence for that at the moment. It's just a vibe, I guess, and again, vibes aren't science. My main problem with the idea that the Knight is like Death's reanimated or something is that we know the Knight is making dark fountains in the Light World, so if they required the Dark Worlds to be alive, then I highly doubt they could exist in the Light World and make a dark fountain. As much as I know some people probably aren't going to hear this, I'm pretty sure the Knight is just a somewhat unique entity, and that probably has to do with its connections to Gaster. Anyways, now that I've mentioned Gaster, it's probably a good time to wrap up the video. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, all that good stuff. Again, like I said at the beginning, this isn't necessarily the video I was planning on making, but I just wanted to, and I think I'm going to just start doing that going forward. I'm not going to try to have too much of a schedule. I'm just going to make what I want, viewership be damned. Or, like, I am very grateful for all the people who watch my videos, but you get what I mean. I have some plans for some bigger video essays about some of these games as a whole, but again, those are coming along slowly, so please don't expect those to come out too quickly. I also was thinking about maybe opening a Patreon or something once I hit 3,000 subscribers, but that came a lot quicker than I thought it would, so if you have any opinions on that, please share that down below too, I guess. I don't know. Regardless, please have a good day. Thank you for watching. Do all the YouTube stuff that I'm obligated to say, like, comment, subscribe, and have a good day to you as well. Thank you for your time today. I'm saying today too much. I'm gonna cut the video.